April 12, 1967. Hill 875, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. The jungle was alive, not with birds, but with gunfire. Damp heat clung to everything. The smell of mud, cordite, and fear mixed into the heavy air as Bravo Company advanced through waist-high elephant grass. Rain dripped from the canopy, darkening the black steel of helmets. The sound of cicadas was drowned by the rattling of automatic fire. Private First Class Michael Donnelly, 19 years old, from Ohio, crouched behind a fallen log. His hands shook as he jammed another magazine into his brand-new rifle, the M16. The weapon was supposed to be the pride of American innovation, lightweight, accurate, self-cleaning, or so the officers said back at base. But when Donnelly squeezed the trigger, nothing happened. He slapped the forward assist. Pulled the charging handle. The casing jammed halfway. A stovepipe jam. His heart pounded as he cursed under his breath, "Come on, work, damn it." All around him, the jungle erupted in chaos. Green tracers sliced through the mist, and the enemy's AK-47s barked from the treeline. Sergeant Hines yelled, "Keep firing. Keep that line tight." But half the platoon couldn't. Their rifles were locked, jammed, useless. Men who should have been firing were now hunched over their weapons, desperately trying to dig out spent casings with their bayonets. Some switched to captured AK-47s just to fight back. Others were cut down before they even had the chance. The M16, the rifle that was supposed to save lives, was now getting men killed. By nightfall, the jungle was silent again, except for the low moans of the wounded. Rain pattered on steel helmets and empty shell casings. Donnelly sat in the mud, staring at his rifle. The barrel was fouled, the chamber black with residue. He looked up at Hines, who shook his head. "This thing's a death trap," the sergeant muttered. And he wasn't wrong. The M16 had entered Vietnam as the symbol of American technological superiority, a rifle lighter and more advanced than anything before it. But in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, it was becoming clear, this sleek, new weapon had been sent into battle unprepared. The soldiers called it the Mattel rifle, because it looked and felt like a toy. Its aluminum frame and plastic stock made it easy to carry, but when it mattered most, it couldn't stand up to the mud, humidity, and filth of combat. Within months, reports were pouring in from across Vietnam, rifles failing in firefights, soldiers dying with jammed weapons in their hands, cleaning rods sticking out of barrels like desperate flags. The Pentagon blamed improper maintenance. But the soldiers knew better. They were told the M16 was self-cleaning. They hadn't even been issued cleaning kits. What began as a promise of progress was turning into a scandal of survival. And behind it all, bureaucracy, politics, and the rush to modernize America's war machine, would reveal just how deadly misplaced confidence could be. Because the M16 didn't just fail on the battlefield, it failed the men who trusted it with their lives. Long before the jungles of Vietnam swallowed its reputation, the M16 had begun as a bright idea, one that promised to change warfare forever. 1957, Armalite Headquarters, Hollywood, California. In a small workshop tucked behind a nondescript building, a handful of engineers worked beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Among them stood Eugene Stoner, a quiet, sharp-minded designer who believed he could build the perfect rifle for the modern soldier. The world had changed since World War II. Rifles were still heavy, cumbersome relics of a bygone era. The U.S. military standard weapon, the M14, fired a powerful 7.62 mm round, accurate at long distances but difficult to control in automatic fire. Soldiers complained it kicked too hard, weighed too much, and jammed in jungle conditions. Stoner envisioned something different, a lightweight rifle that could fire smaller, faster rounds with deadly accuracy. He called his design the AR-15, AR for Armalite rifle, not assault rifle, as many would later assume. The weapon was radical. It used space-age materials, aluminum for the receiver, fiberglass for the stock, and a revolutionary direct impingement gas system that channeled gas directly into the bolt to cycle the action. It was light, sleek, and futuristic. When Stoner brought the AR-15 to the Pentagon in 1958, the Army brass scoffed. "It's too small," one general said. "A toy gun. No stopping power." The military's old guard couldn't imagine replacing their beloved M14 with something that looked like it belonged in science fiction. But others saw potential. The U.S. Air Force, under General Curtis LeMay, took interest. LeMay wanted a lighter rifle for airbase security, something his men could carry easily. In 1960, he ordered a small batch of AR-15s for testing. The results were impressive. Soldiers could carry twice the ammunition for half the weight. The smaller 5.56 mm rounds were fast, accurate, and deadly at close range. The gun's accuracy stunned testers. In one demonstration, Stoner's rifle cut a watermelon clean in half, the high-velocity round causing massive internal damage despite its small size. Soon, the AR-15 caught the attention of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man obsessed with modernization and data-driven efficiency. McNamara, a former Ford executive, believed numbers could solve everything, even war. To him, the AR-15 wasn't just a weapon, it was progress incarnate. By 1963, McNamara had decided, the AR-15, now rebranded the M16, would become the new standard rifle of the U.S. military. Production was rushed. Orders were placed. Within a year, the rifle was being shipped to American troops heading to Vietnam. But there was a problem, several, in fact. The rifle Stoner had built was not the rifle the Army delivered. McNamara's bureaucrats, eager to streamline logistics, changed the gunpowder in the ammunition to a different type, one that produced more fouling. They ignored Stoner's specifications, and they never informed the soldiers. The Army also removed the chrome lining from the barrel and chamber to cut costs, making the weapon far more vulnerable to rust and corrosion. And most fatally, soldiers were told the rifle was self-cleaning. Cleaning kits were deemed unnecessary. The manuals omitted basic maintenance instructions. So when those rifles arrived in the hot, humid jungles of Vietnam, filled with fouling, unchromed chambers, and no cleaning tools, they began to fail catastrophically. What had begun as a visionary design by a man who cared about precision was now a bureaucratic compromise, a weapon engineered by politics rather than by soldiers. By 1966, Eugene Stoner had left Armalite. His creation was no longer his own. And halfway around the world, his dream weapon was turning into a soldier's nightmare. May 21, 1967. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. The jungle-swallowed sound, thick air, dripping with humidity, muffled the distant echoes of gunfire. But when the ambush came, it came like lightning. AK-47s cracked from the tree line, muzzle flashes flickering through the mist. Second Lieutenant Tom Riley dropped behind a rice paddy dike, yelling over the roar of bullets, "Return fire. Get some lead out there." The men of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, raised their new M16 rifles. This was their first combat action with the weapon, and they trusted it. They'd been told it was lighter, more accurate, and faster firing than anything the enemy had. Then the firing line began to break down. Guns jammed, someone shouted. Another voice echoed from the left flank, "Mine too." Riley turned to see his men frantically working their rifles, pounding the forward assist, trying to clear jammed casings. He could hear the metallic clicks and slaps, the desperate rhythm of men fighting their weapons instead of the enemy. The North Vietnamese soldiers were still firing. Their AK-47s, rugged and simple, barked relentlessly. Designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov, the AK could fire underwater, after being buried in mud, or left in the rain for weeks. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The M16, on the other hand, was sleek, elegant, and choking on its own fouling. One Marine, Corporal Jack Taylor, ripped open his rifle and cursed as he pulled out a stuck cartridge, the rim torn off from trying to extract it. He reached for his cleaning rod, but he didn't have one. Nobody did. "Use your bayonet," Riley shouted. "Knock it loose." Mud, sweat, and panic. The men were on their own. After 20 brutal minutes, the ambush broke. The Marines pushed forward, supported by machine gun fire from the rear. When the firing finally stopped, Riley looked around. Several men were down, one slumped against a tree, his M16 disassembled beside him. Riley picked it up. The chamber was black, coated with carbon and unburned powder. The magazine was half full. The gun had jammed on the third round. He slammed it down into the mud. Back at base, the story spread fast. Letters home told of rifles that wouldn't shoot. Bodies were found with their weapons partially disassembled, evidence they had died trying to fix them mid-battle. One Marine wrote, "We left cleaning rods sticking out of our barrels to show command what's happening out here. Maybe they'll notice." The troops began calling the M16 the weapon you die with. Meanwhile, stateside, the Pentagon brushed aside the complaints. Reports were buried. Officials insisted the rifle was functioning properly, that the troops simply weren't maintaining them correctly. But soldiers weren't fools. They knew the difference between a dirty gun and a bad gun. And as the casualty reports grew, so did the resentment. Letters from the front lines leaked to the press. Congressional hearings were called. At Fort Benning, a weapons inspector laid out two rifles side by side, an AK-47 and an M16 recovered from the field. The AK was filthy, but it fired flawlessly. The M16, clean and oiled, jammed on the second round. It was no longer just a battlefield issue, it was a national embarrassment. Under the intense glare of the media and public outrage, the truth began to surface. The ammunition change, from the cleaner IMR powder to the dirtier ball powder, had dramatically increased fouling in the chamber. Combined with the lack of chrome plating and no cleaning kits, the rifle had been set up to fail before it even arrived in Vietnam. By 1968, the U.S. Army could no longer deny the disaster. Emergency shipments of cleaning kits were flown into bases across Southeast Asia. New manuals were issued, this time admitting the rifle needed regular maintenance. Chrome plating was reinstated in barrels and chambers. But for many, the damage was already done. The soldiers who had carried the early M16s would never forget, or forgive, what they saw. To them, the weapon wasn't a symbol of progress. It was a symbol of betrayal. Washington, D.C., 1968. Thousands of miles from the jungles of Vietnam, under the cold glow of fluorescent lights, a different kind of war was being fought, one waged with reports, testimonies, and classified memos instead of rifles. Inside the Rayburn House office building, members of Congress sat before microphones, their expressions grim. Across from them sat officers in crisp uniforms, executives from Colt, and government officials from the Department of Defense. On the walls hung photographs, haunting black and white images of American soldiers lying dead, their rifles disassembled beside them. Chairman Richard Ichord of the House Armed Services Committee leaned forward, tapping a stack of documents. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "our soldiers are dying with jammed weapons in their hands. We want to know why." What followed was an avalanche of finger-pointing. The Army blamed the ammunition. The ammunition suppliers blamed the weapon's design. Colt blamed the Pentagon for altering specifications. The Pentagon blamed the troops for poor maintenance. But the truth, laid bare piece by piece, was damning. Eugene Stoner's original AR-15 design had been tested with a specific type of gunpowder, MR powder, clean burning and ideal for the rifle's gas system. But when McNamara's Whiz Kids took over procurement, they switched to ball powder, a cheaper variant already in large supply for other weapons. It produced higher pressure and excessive fouling, clogging the chamber after only a few magazines of rapid fire. And it wasn't just the powder. Cost-cutting had stripped away the rifle's chrome-lined chamber, a feature Stoner had insisted on to prevent corrosion. In Vietnam's humidity, this omission was fatal. Even worse, the Army had declared the rifle self-cleaning. Troops were never given proper maintenance kits, and the training manuals omitted any mention of frequent cleaning. When soldiers requested cleaning gear, they were told it wasn't necessary. Colonel Harold Yount, a logistics officer, testified under oath, "We were told the M16 was the most reliable rifle ever made. In reality, we issued it without testing it properly under combat conditions." The hearings exposed how bureaucratic arrogance and corporate interests had turned a promising design into a lethal liability. Back at the Colt factory in Hartford, Connecticut, executives defended themselves. The weapon performed as designed, one claimed. Field conditions may have varied. But by then, the story had already spread across the nation. Newspapers called it the rifle that failed America. Even Eugene Stoner, now working with another firearms company, was drawn into the fray. In interviews, he expressed quiet frustration. "They changed the ammunition, the materials, the specifications, and then they blamed the rifle," he said. "The AR-15 worked. What they sent to Vietnam was not my rifle." Behind closed doors, McNamara's team scrambled to contain the damage. A new variant, the M16A1, was already being rushed into production. It included chrome-lined chambers, a forward assist, and improved cleaning kits. But the reputational damage was irreversible. For the young men in Vietnam, these improvements came too late. Their trust in the weapon, and in the system that armed them, had already shattered. Letters from the front told the story in raw, unfiltered words. One sergeant wrote home, "We don't fear the Viet Cong half as much as we fear our rifles jamming." And another, "We call it the Mattel gun. Looks good. Shoots good, for about 10 rounds." It was more than just a mechanical failure. It was a moral one. Because in every rifle that jammed, in every man who fell clutching a useless weapon, there was a question that echoed far beyond the battlefield: how could the world's most powerful army send its soldiers to war with a gun that didn't work? As the hearings concluded, Congress demanded accountability. The Pentagon promised reforms. Colt promised fixes. The Army revised training. But the stain remained. The M16 would eventually evolve, it would become reliable, even legendary, in later decades. But in 1967 and 1968, that meant little to the men who had already paid the price. In the damp, blood-soaked jungles of Vietnam, soldiers had learned a hard truth: technology means nothing if it can't be trusted when it matters most. March 1969. Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam. The sun bled through a haze of smoke and humidity as the patrol moved along a muddy jungle trail. The men of Delta Company, 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, were on edge. Ambushes had become routine this deep in enemy territory. Corporal Frank Morales adjusted the strap of his helmet and glanced down at the rifle in his hands, an M16A1. It looked like the same weapon the Marines had cursed just 2 years earlier, but this one was different. The barrel was chrome-lined, the ammunition cleaner burning, the manual brutally honest about maintenance. A small pouch on his belt carried a compact cleaning kit, brushes, rods, and patches, something the first generation of M16 users had never received. "Keep your rifles dry, keep them clean," his squad leader had said that morning. "The new ones run fine if you take care of them." And for the first time in years, that was true. When the ambush hit, sudden, loud, violent, Morales dropped to a knee and fired. The rifle barked sharply, brass shells spinning into the dirt. It didn't jam. It didn't choke. Round after round left the barrel with precision. Morales took down 2 Viet Cong fighters before they melted back into the tree line. "Good shooting," Sergeant Denton called. Morales nodded, his heart hammering. His rifle had done exactly what it was supposed to. The M16A1, once despised, was beginning to earn its redemption. By late 1969, the tide had started to turn. The new rifles were arriving across the theater in large numbers, and soldiers immediately noticed the difference. Chrome lining prevented rust, the new ball powder formulation produced less fouling, and the inclusion of the forward assist allowed soldiers to manually push a round into battery when needed. Cleaning kits were issued with every rifle, and the training manuals finally reflected reality: clean the weapon daily, more often if you fire it. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Reports of catastrophic jamming began to drop sharply. Confidence slowly returned. For the first time in years, troops began trusting their rifles again, though many would never forget the betrayal of the early models. Still, the scars remained. Veterans of earlier tours would sit with newcomers and shake their heads. "You kids don't know how lucky you got," one sergeant told a fresh recruit. Back in '66, that thing was a death sentence. Meanwhile, in the United States, Colt and the Department of Defense were eager to reclaim public trust. Propaganda films were released showing soldiers in clean uniforms firing the M16 flawlessly in test ranges. Pamphlets titled "Your New Rifle," the M16A1, circulated through bases, highlighting its improved reliability and ease of use. But the veterans who had lived through the earlier failures weren't buying it. To them, the damage was done. The M16 had already written its name into military infamy. Yet, paradoxically, this dark chapter became the foundation for the rifle's future success. The painful lessons learned in Vietnam shaped decades of weapons development. Every malfunction, every jammed casing, every congressional hearing forced the U.S. military to rethink how it tested, approved, and deployed its weapons. In time, the M16 evolved into a family of firearms: the M16A2, A3, and A4, and later the M4 carbine, used by modern American forces. The same core design that failed so disastrously in the 1960s would go on to become one of the most successful and widely used rifles in the world. But its transformation came at a steep price, paid in blood, frustration, and hard-won experience. Years later, Eugene Stoner reflected on the saga with quiet bitterness. "The rifle worked when we built it," he said in an interview. "It worked when we tested it. What failed wasn't the weapon, it was the system." And in many ways, he was right. The story of the M16 in Vietnam wasn't just about engineering or materials. It was about human arrogance, the belief that innovation could replace understanding, that data could replace experience, that soldiers could adapt to failures born in offices thousands of miles away. It was a story of how war punishes mistakes, mercilessly, immediately, and often fatally. June 1970. At a small outpost near the Cambodian border, Corporal Morales sat cleaning his rifle by the flicker of a campfire. The jungle hummed quietly around him, alive with the sounds of insects and distant gunfire. He pulled a clean patch through the chamber and smiled faintly. It slid through smooth as glass. "Thing runs like a champ now," he said to the sergeant beside him. The sergeant grinned, poking at the fire. "Took long enough to fix it." Morales nodded. "Yeah, but I guess we had to bleed for it first." The two men sat in silence for a while, their rifles resting nearby, the same weapon that had once betrayed soldiers now keeping them alive. In the end, the M16 story wasn't just one of failure or redemption. It was a mirror, reflecting the cost of rushing technology into war, and the resilience of the men forced to fight with it. Because for every weapon ever built, there's one truth that never changes. It's not the gun that wins the war. It's the man who carries it, and survives its flaws.